Hello and welcome to our talk, Thinking in Shades of Red. Just a quick introduction of what we're going to be discussing here today. We're going to go over an overview of the methodology, the mindset that we've been approaching and why we felt the need to kind of do this talk. Then kind of go through infrastructure, some pieces on that, really focus in on what we like to try to do, and then some of the more key important phases of a red team. And overall, we'll kind of wrap up with a bit of a review before we head into questions. But the real, reason why we wanted to do this talk today was to kind of show, some of the techniques that we've been using with high success and kind of demystify and break them down in, a fun war story type of deal. So who am I? Very briefly, I'm Matthew Adderberg. I'm an engineering fellow here in Optiv's threat management team. I run our adversary simulation services, as well as authored numerous open source tools, really focusing a lot of the research and time around EDRs, evasions, and other type of bypasses. Microsoft Hall of Famer regarding some comm research, and I've spoken at numerous conferences such as DEF CONs, Red Team Village, Adversary Village, DerbyCon, B-Sides Las Vegas. Here with me today is Aaron Martin. Aaron, would you like to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, sure. Aaron Martin, technical manager with Optiv. I'm also one of the adversarial simulation services leads. I have about 12 years experience in the InfoSec community with a targeted experience in various red teaming services, as well as computer network exploitation against various government entities. I spoke at last year's Source ZeroCon, and I'm an author of several Optiv blog posts. So we're just going to do an overview here of what we'll be covering in today's PowerPoint presentation. So threat actors, as we all know, are evolving. Their tactics and techniques that have emerged over the years are ever changing. This fluid nature has left a false sense of security for some companies looking to defend themselves against these covert and not as commonly used avenues of attack. So we'll be walking through some techniques that we've used on engagements, as well as some things that threat actors are doing these days. And the intended purpose here is we're trying to educate blue teams for possibilities and avenues of attacks that they may not be privy to, as well as any aspiring red teamers on the knowledge required and the different approach you have to take when it comes to the difference between these types of engagements and your typical penetration test. So first, we're going to talk about infrastructure setup. So when we talk about infrastructure setup, we're talking about what we're going to be using for anything active against the client. We'll start with that, then we'll kind of talk about command and control. So if we're doing any active probing, we're going to be going over OSINT and all the passive OSINT you can do without actually probing a client or target organization. When it does come time to do that, typically cloud services are what we use to engage in that kind of activity. So we'll be anonymizing our traffic, proxying through various cloud, either EC2 instances or any kind of cloud instance that will be just changing IPs on requests, as well as user agent strings to kind of blend that traffic in. So it's not attributable and it's not drawing a pattern. When we talk about command and control, this is the backend infrastructure we may use once we gain internal access to conduct that post-exploitation. There's a few different things we like to use. Typically, we'll use redirectors. So we're not actually exposing any of our backend infrastructure. We'll use cloud fronting to essentially hide our true domain that, say, our payload may be calling back to. We'll use strict firewall rules to blacklist any known security proof point scanners, any email gateway scanners, or CIDR ranges. And when we talk about this, there's also long haul versus short term. So we may do some quick build and burn infrastructure. If it's not, say, our backend infrastructure for our command and control, if we need something short term that we want to use, we may have a long haul um, as a backup that is just there in case we need to session pass to a different C2. And then when we talk about external C2 channels, things such as Slack and Office 365. So this is essentially what our traffic is looking like when it's communicating back to our command and control. External C2s are becoming more prevalent these days, and that traffic, which has always been kind of a cat and mouse game, is evolving and it becoming harder and harder to detect using external C2 channels such as Slack or Office 365.
Perfect. So now we'll kind of dive right into reconnaissance. Once we have our infrastructure, we actually can start doing some reconnaissance before we even get to that phase of attacking. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is right. We're not flying blind. In these types of assessments, everything is black box. So you have to get that data yourself. It's not provided. Because we're emulating nation states and these major cyber sophisticated threat actors, they're performing these attacks over months or sometimes years. So understanding and being very targeted with your time to understand what you have and how to get more information is very key. And there's some major things out there, and it's really easy. It just takes a lot of time and very fine-tooth comb, if you will, I like to say, to filter down a lot of the noise into solid actionable data. You could start off with, if you're targeting a company, the name of the company. So from there, you can start looking at records such as DNS. From there, from passive reconnaissance, you can start building out subdomains and other information like that. That's also very important when you're thinking about phishing or anything else, because you really want to blend in. If everyone sees a domain, let's say Acme, and you put another M on it, most likely those looping or double I type of characters blend right into your human eye because you've read it so many times. So it's very important when you're looking at subdomains and other things like that, you keep that in for phishing. It also tells you what the schema, what type of services they use. If you see a lot of remote, office, MFA sort of things like that. If you see names of vendors that do these types of services, that gives you an idea of what's in the environment. And that's really key to understand what's in this system. If you're going to come in with the mindset that you're attacking a Windows environment and it's all Linux, your plan of attack is already going to fail before it gets out the door. So one of the most important things, I stress this to everyone, is get the data. If you don't have the data, you can't be successful. And where do you get some of the data? Well, one of the best areas these days is social media. I'm sure we've all heard about it, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, but honestly, these still are great places with how connected social media is to both a business for marketing, as well as people sharing their lives, honestly, online. You can get a great sense of the office, the environment, the culture. Even from LinkedIn, when you look at it, people post what types of services or specialty skills they have. That kind of gives you an idea. Oh, I'm an Oracle admin at Acme, once again. Well, now you know they have an admin for Oracle, so they must have Oracle in the environment. Same thing with their job postings. If they say, hey, we're looking for someone who has SAP knowledge or anything with regards to Red Hat, you now know that they have a need for that. So that gives you great pieces of information. Facebook, Twitter, people love to post pictures and stuff. You won't believe how many times Aaron and I have had success finding, passwords, sensitive client data even, as well as badge photos, just from looking at people's Twitter and Facebook, as well as Instagram. We've managed to be able to get access to, even sensitive things such as credit card data just by looking at people's, what's in the background of people's desks. Like, when people are taking a picture of their lunch and themselves, well, they usually have their work up. They don't really kind of think about that. And right there are points of information, whether or not they're actually showing sensitive data, but they show the type of, environment. If it's a Mac, if it's Linux or Windows, what applications do they have open? If the user you're targeting in that picture is an accountant and they have a bunch of Excel documents open, they use Excel. So that's a great idea for that phishing, going back to that same idea about getting that data. So it really is one of the best places to get information. Another great way, especially when we're talking about active attacks, is finding out who's employed, their username schema, and everything else. That changes, especially as people come and go from jobs, their contract positions. So that sometimes can be really hard. So there are many services out there that do data aggregation for you. So we can scrape them who are scraping other sources to get that accurate data. And you can kind of see right here, this is an internal tool of ours that I developed that really just focuses on scraping, and you can get some really amazing data points because from various sources. So you can get their first and last name, their position, even their location, as well as a rough idea about their email schema. So all these things are really important, whether it be for password guessing, targeted social engineering, targeted pretexting, or anything that you're doing if you have any type of a component where you have to go on site or you're trying to break in physically. Having all these services and being able to finally, focus down this data is really important, which kind of leads us to this next point. How do you validate the data? How do you focus down? Because you have all this data out here. How do you really get down and say, this is the accurate data, this is old stale data, or this is wrong? There are many different ways to do this, but it's not a science. It's very much an art form. OSINT and all this reconnaissance, oftentimes you'll find that you'll be doing an engagement, you'll gather all your information, you'll start an attack and realize you got to go back, get more information, or what you thought you had was wrong. And so there are a lot of great ways, but the one surefire way we love is using Microsoft. Microsoft is synonymous with every company in the world. Pretty much everyone uses it. So there are a lot of features and configurations, especially when we talk about cloud and cross integration, that can be utilized by us to understand it. And one of them is the Microsoft's Team API. When you authenticate very briefly as a user, into Teams or in a lot of Microsoft products online via Office 365, you receive a bear token. And what you could do with that is actually replay that to the API of Teams along with a request for a specific user. And this user doesn't have to be in your organization. It could be external. I don't know if you've ever in your work career seen, but you can actually send a message from one organization to another. And you can also search someone and see, hey, they're out of the office. Well, this is all done through this API. So we've kind of listed a tool. We really want to give a shout out to the open source community here. We're big fans of open source tooling. We contribute a lot here at Optiv. So we want to recognize them. So the first one we want to recognize is the authors of Teams User Enum. They did an amazing job from Immune IT, really to focus and kind of automate this process using this bear token. You can simply provide a list of users and it will go through. And it actually will tell you which ones are active, which ones are not, and with those active ones that are valid, what the actual response that you get and see. So here in this sample one that we've kind of created, you can kind of see this user exists, but they're away from their desk and they have even an out of office message and we're able to read it. So now you have a bit more information right there because now you have HR support. This user works for HR. You just confirmed that this user exists. They might have some affiliation to HR, and you got another email account, as well as a cell phone. So it's very important. There are many great tools. This is one great example, but be given how interconnected and the jump to the cloud, using something like this is a key successful metric for us in a lot of our engagements. Over to you, Aaron.
Great. So now we're going to talk about initial access. So from a black box approach, there's a couple different ways you can go about this. We're going to start with all that data we just gathered from the passive OSINT and any other aggregation of users that we may have found for, we'll say, Acme in this case. So when we do go to actually do a password guessing campaign, there's a few things we like to keep in mind. One of which being that initial infrastructure that we talked about. We'll typically spin up quite a few instances to make sure that each one of those requests is one being throttled with a delay and is coming from a unique IP address as well as user agent string. This kind of stays under the threshold of detection due to the inability to not really generating a pattern there. And then with using the delays, it's not uncommon for a user to type their password in incorrectly. And if we're not going through this list again for another couple of days, it's definitely not out of the ordinary for a user to mistype their password a couple times a week. So to ensure legitimacy, this is some of the things we do when we're actually conducting password spraying. And sometimes during OSINT, if we identify that a company's corporate location is, say, on the East Coast, or maybe in California, or maybe in Canada, we'll ensure that we're only using cloud services and instances that are located in those regions, because it would look out of place if a lot of incorrect password attempts are coming from, say, Virginia when the client's located in Canada. So now let's move on to, let's say we do get a valid password. There's error codes that you can use when you're debugging a lot of these different tools that will tell you what that AAD error code is. In some cases, there's an error code known as conditional access or token not issued due to conditional access problems. So some of the first things we like to do is verify with various APIs that Microsoft has in place. These could be the Azure Core Management, native Windows 10 Mail app, the Microsoft Graph API, Exchange Web Services. A lot of times we see on engagements that if ActiveSync or Exchange Web Services is enabled, those legacy protocols by default aren't supporting multi-factor authentication. And a lot of times with, say, a mobile user agent string or a different user agent string than, say, like Windows or something along those lines, we may be able to get access to a user's inbox or additional resources. There's different tools you can use to quickly check for these misconfigurations, and a lot of times you need to be very careful when you're doing this to make sure you have the correct password, because it will conduct quite a few password attempts in a quick short order. So let's say legacy authentication. We've tried this and MFA is enabled on everything. Exchange Web Services isn't working. We weren't able to enroll the native Windows 10 Mail app. We got an error there. So from there, we can move into conditional access bypass. So essentially what we're doing here, and we're going to talk about this a little later, a topic called bring your own VM. But essentially all this is standing up a standard VM, clean VM, not associated with anything, making sure you're proxying all the traffic through that non-attributable infrastructure. And with the correct credentials that you have, you actually can go in natively through the Windows GUI and connect your account to a company's Azure Active Directory. So a lot of the passive OSINT we may have done would, let's say, we identified they have a hybrid joined environment. So they have an Azure Active Directory as well as an on-prem Active Directory. So in that case, we can actually connect our VM with the correct credentials to a company's Azure Active Directory. And from here, this gives us a few additional approaches. We're not exactly in just yet. As you can see there, that will be the typical response you would get from running dsreg. You'll be Azure AD joined, but you won't be enterprise or domain joined. Another thing you want to do is keep a device name generic. Typically, VMs will already have a desktop with a subset of serial numbers, so that's fine. But if you have any knowledge of the company's internal schema for workstations, you can change your NetBIOS name to kind of assimilate with their infrastructure. But moving into the next slide, so from here, essentially what you can do with when you connect your Azure AD device, you'll have a primary refresh token. In some cases, depending on what kind of controls the company has in place for conditional access, you may be able to use this primary refresh token in a tool known as AAD internals. It is a fantastic PowerShell. It's actually a collection of modules that allows you to interact with all kinds of things related to Azure APIs, anything really along those lines. So what you can do with that primary refresh token is attempt to join your device, as well as you can enroll your device if the company's using any third-party, or sorry, not third-party MDM, but if they're using Intune, you can attempt to enroll your device in Intune. This is typically an essential part of a device actually being brought into the on-prem or fully joining that hybrid environment, because the device has to be compliant and approved to access resources on the network. A lot of times, if you're able to do that, there's APIs that you can bypass that won't require MFA that you can use. So these access tokens can be used to access things like the Graph API that previously with just credentials you weren't able to access. Some things you can do though is you can actually parse these primary refresh tokens and access tokens, and you can see what the authentication methods are. So in the case here, you can see there that PWD is just password, user credentials, and RSA would be an RSA token or something of the like. But what you really want there is an MFA imprint for that token. That lets that access token, that lets those APIs know that that access token has access that will allow them to access any MFA restricted resources. So when we're moving into device code phishing, so let's say that didn't work. You joined a device to a hybrid environment. You weren't able to either fake compliance or join that device to Intune. There's ways of actually using phishing technique known as OAuth device code phishing to essentially send, you can craft whatever template you would like, but essentially what you're doing is sending a code to a user that they will use to enroll their device. This can be done a couple ways. You can actually set up your own tenant. If you have an M365 enterprise account, you could set up your own tenant ID and application, and you can actually use that to request everything from a user that enrolls with that application, or you can actually just use the standard device logon. It's a legitimate domain, and categorization isn't needed. So on the next slide, there's a tool known as Token Tactics. There's a few different tools you can use. This one is has ease of use because it's kind of all encompassing. You actually have to generate an SSO nonce when you're generating these codes. So as you can see there, that user code is what you would use for your template to phish a user, and that verification URL is where they would go. Obviously, that URL is not going to be blocked because that is a standard Microsoft device login domain, and this tool will actually pull that API every 10 seconds with that, looking for that user code. This is the way that that actually you can gain the access token and refresh token of that user. So say you send a fish to a user, they're logged into their internal corporate domain. They have a primary refresh token with a MFA imprint. So when they actually enroll here, you can see down there at the bottom, you'll actually, you're pulling this site every 10 seconds, and you'll actually gain access to their refresh token as well as their access token for whatever client API that you requested. As you can see here in this case, we requested an access token for MS Graph. There's multiple you can use. There's MS Teams, there's O365 Office apps, there's OWA if you would like to say dump the global address list. But in this case, which we'll show in the next slide, we used MS Graph, which allows you to conduct reconnaissance against the against Azure AD. So this is just showing what that access token looks like when you have a authentication method with password, that's Windows integrated authentication, and an MFA imprint. So if you tried those first conditional access bypasses with enrolling your device and it didn't work, it may be that a company has super strict restriction policies that say either only coming from an internal corporate approved device would this work. So when you conduct a phish, you actually get that access token of an internal corporate compliant device with an MFA imprint. And then with that access token, there's a lot of different things you can do. We'll talk about here just a couple of things. So we talked about Azure API endpoints. So with Graph and MS Graph access tokens, you can actually, again, use AAD internals to connect to Azure AD and the Microsoft Online service. And you'll actually be able to enumerate all the users, groups, devices, any tenant information, contact addresses that are associated with that company. So literally you can dump all of the hybrid Active Directory users and groups. And we've seen in the past where this flies under the radar a lot of times because those hybrid, those cloud services will be interacting with the internal Exchange servers or whatever configuration a company has, but all they see is it talking to an external non-attributable IP, and they can only see that internal traffic. So if it's a very large domain, they might not see that traffic as inordinary because those cloud services and internal server or domain controllers are talking all the time. Some other things you can do with Azure Recon is you can look for abusable service principals. In the case you land on, say, an engineer or somebody that has access to applications or VMs within Azure, you may be able to privilege escalate that way without ever having an internal foothold in the network. And that is something that we'll pick back up on when we get to post-exploitation.
Yeah. So we kind of talked about Azure. So now let's kind of talk about phishing, because there's always still going to be some kind of component where you're going to need to get some kind of credentials. You hope. Unfortunately, with the amount of focus and everything else, phishing for credentials isn't always a one-to-one ratio for success, especially with the introduction of VDIs, VPNs, or any type of MFA controls. Having credentials these days is actually very less important, as you can kind of see with what Aaron talked about with the tokens. The tokens are way more valuable than anything. And that's really why we kind of steer away from just focusing on, getting like spinning up a username and auth portal and just grabbing the credentials. Because oftentimes that just gives us credentials. It may not give us any access because they're protected by MFA, privileges. There needs to be some kind of session ID to get access to their external applications. So we really kind of rely on non-traditional methods of phishing. And they're really hard to detect because this is not so much a technical control, more of, being very creative and cheeky. to be blunt. There are so many different things that defenders have to focus on that a creative, nuanced way of getting some kind of access, whether that is phishing for session tokens, device phishing, as Aaron once just described, that's harder to stop, especially if it's coming from legitimate sources or applications that you need to allow access out that are legitimate or mission critical to the business. It becomes really hard to kind of filter and stop that. And so a lot of times, we've seen this time and time again, they're often ignored. And as a result, the primary focus is, hey, if you get an email from an unknown source, they're asking you to do something, there's an attachment or a link, don't go to those things. So the focus is always on that email is bad. So what happens when you go a different route? What happens if, say, once again, we take a different approach with a Microsoft service such as Microsoft Teams? A lot of times this has been set up by default for that, once again, that cross communication I mentioned earlier. But very, very briefly, you can kind of interact with someone and all it shows with Microsoft is the name and then a little external tag, really tiny. And so with that, when you can actually communicate over someone and you could, depending on how clever your ruse is or your story, the narrative you're telling, get them to kind of perform some actions. In fact, a lot of times, I just was on a red team this week where a lot of the organization's controls were, hey, we're not going to actually communicate you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send you your temporary password over Teams because it's a trusted source. So a lot of times organizations trust these other, I would like to say third party, but they're all under Microsoft, they're all owned, but something that's not email. And so with this, we can be very successful. And in this case, we can literally, if we have someone's passwords, but we can't get in because there's VPN, two-factor, and all this stuff, we can create another ruse where we interact with them and say, hey, something's going on. We don't want your password. So instantly, we're not like asking for the traditional things that they've been taught through social, security awareness programs to never disclose. All we need to do is we got to do a sync, or in this case, just to make sure that everything is working because we're going to reset it really quick. You should be able to get a code in a second. Can you just make sure that code that you have aligns with what we're seeing? And in this case, it's very trusting because no one thinks about the code. They just think about the passwords. And with this type of attack, it's really easy. You just need a Microsoft Office 365 account, just the business one or enterprise. And those are very cheap. And for the type of engagement, you could probably not, oftentimes they give you a refund if your engagement doesn't go over a whole month. So keeping that in mind, this is, very inexpensive, but highly effective. And we'll kind of show you why. I like to say, don't always worry about jumping in and establishing a C2 channel. For someone like me who does a lot of research on that, for people to hear that, they're usually shocked. But it's true. Live off the land. Use their VPN. If using that VM that Aaron was talking about, where you spin up. If you get their clients, you do all this, you can authenticate. Well, now you're legitimately part of the network. Everyone's looking for stuff coming in, but you're coming in through a known channel. So in this case, we were able to successfully do this and establish ourselves on the VPN. That's great. We're now in, can't be seen. We're not going to our C2 infrastructure just yet, but we're entrenched inside the network. But we noticed, especially, there are some kind of controls and stuff. A lot of organizations are deploying software that actually isolates external hosts or people that are remoting in. And you can kind of see right here, even their intranet site was blocked. They didn't trust anything that was coming, that if you are a VPN user, nothing. It was the definition of zero trust. So even with VPN these days, you can still get in, but it's not fully access. And so you probably think, okay, well, this is, a failed attack. Well, not necessarily, because there's always something that has to be interacted with. There has to be some kind of access. Like it can't just be, hey, you're on our network and you're never going to see anything. You're just behind a giant wall. You'll never be seen. So I always like to say, let's look at the domain controllers. And in this case, they had blocked everything but some of the services such as Kerberos. They even blocked LDAP for a bit, not LDAP secure, ironically. No 445, anything else, but Kerberos was there and LDAP, one of LDAP services. So we were able to actually execute Certify, which basically exploits the Active Directory certified services. So using the domain controller and their certificate server, we were actually able to pull down certs for domain admins and get the clear text and TLM hash from the VPN. So everything else was locked down. But because now we had some kind of access, we were able to prove and find out that they had RDP running on a non-standard port because it wasn't looked at. Zscaler wasn't blocking it because they didn't know about that port. So once we had that, we were able to then authenticate to the domain controller and then pivot into the network that way. So one of the reasons we like to kind of bring up this story is that, it's small things that build up to make a very powerful attack chain. And if we kind of go back to, hey, you have multi-factor, you can't log into anything, talk to the user. Just talk, very simple, wasn't a complex, got the value, got onto the network isolated, problems, but there was domain access. There are numerous different attacks. If you can access a domain controller, from this to even curve roasting, where you can get access, and then it's all a matter of what you can do with that access and what you can see, because it's never 100%. There's always going to be improvements. A landscape, especially internally, is constantly changing. So finding that small little flaw or that crack or that misconfig is very key, and it takes a lot of time and patience, so don't dismiss it. So from that point, we kind of move into command and control. So we kind of talked a lot about cloud services, but it's very powerful, especially if you're using, say, let's say Azure or AWS. They are a major part of the internet these days, and just straight out blocking them for an organization causes disruptions. Trust us, we've seen it. We've had, in a type of purple team simulation, clients' great idea was, what if we just blocked AWS? They didn't realize that most of their services that were customer facing were living in AWS. So they had massive outages just by trying to block all AWS. So it's really hard to just simply block all cloud services. And it's very easy for anyone to sign up for them. So that's one reason why living in the cloud is very effective. And it's harder to attribute, hey, this domain is related to this group or this type of a hacker, or hey, this is coming from malicious places out in, say, other nations. But how do you stop it once they start looking at your traffic? Well, that's where like blacklisting and knowing where these products, a lot of these products are not using like a manual person to start to investigate. There's a lot of automated controls that are in place. When you have automation, which is great, I don't want it to sound like we are bashing on automation, but there are opportunities to go around or circumvent automation. So if you know what ranges you're expecting the traffic to come from, you block everything else and allow that traffic to your C2. Or if you know what certain products, security products use for scanning or checking things out, you can just block them with a firewall, as we kind of talked about. This is really where it's key. Multiple redirectors is also really great, especially when you're setting things up. That way, if they see one domain and they block that, having a redirector that says, hey, we're going to go try a different one, or even just moving from one hop to another, means that if something gets burnt, your actual C2 is still protected. It's just that hop needs to be replaced. And there's many different things you can do, especially with a lot of the C2s out there, where you can have it set. They say, hey, try domain A, try domain B, try domain C. Domain A is blocked. I can't reach it. Let's try the next one. And they can be rotating in different ways. So it's very effective to have multiple ones that then eventually lead to your central C2. That way you're always keeping them one step ahead. If they knock down one domain, you have a bunch in reserve. And that's then kind of leads us into the last point I want to talk about before we go further into post-X about C2 is, once you have that C2 channel, you have to make sure it blends in. Machines and computers, they're not going to look for abnormal behavior. They're going to look for behavioral stuff that they've been taught to look for that's malicious, very binary, or ones and zeros, sort of cut and dry. They're not going to see, hey, why is Sally from accounting all of a sudden going to this new website and sending 1,000 requests in a minute? That's something where like machine learning is coming, but they're up to eventually, but there's still lots of rooms to exploit that. But that's why a human is going to always be part of the security defensive strategy, because if anyone looked at that it would look suspicious. Same thing with if, hey, why is this binary, that's called ZWGFT calling out to CloudFront or Azure's Edge or something like that every minute on the dot. It's doing that. So really trying to blend in, understanding if you can kind of adjust your traffic, your profile, how you are communicating, what you're doing in memory, what you look like in memory, to how you're coming in, how you're coming out, what you're doing, it makes it harder for someone to look at it. You have to also keep in mind that when they're not doing that, they're not just looking at your endpoint. If they are, they're focusing on your endpoint that you've compromised. Something else has already triggered that alert. And at this point, the game is gone. But they have to look at the organization as a whole. So one host versus maybe if this organization is 10,000, it's different to see all that traffic. So how do you get something on there? Well, deployment or delivery, as I always said, I talked a lot about this in another talk here at SourceZeroCon this year, but very briefly, delivery is such a key important role in this story, because without it, how are you going to get it on? You can't just take your implant and just throw it and hope it sticks to the endpoint. There has to be some kind of way that you get on the box and execute it. And so much so that Microsoft has actually started doing things with what they call mark of the web, to be kind of treat any type of files or executables that are coming from the web with a mark to indicate that they are coming from an external source. This can be something that can be integrated into email filters, mail tools, even EDR products. In fact, Microsoft's Internet Explorer does it by default now, which makes typical means of using tools like LOL bins to download DLLs, HTAs, exe files, you name it, kind of get a flag or a tag on them that says, hey, they came from the internet, and you can just block those because it's not the proper way of downloading it. You can kind of tune it that way. But with everything, there is an exception or a way around it. So there are different extensions that can be used to smuggle in payloads that still work, even with this market web. And we kind of listed 3 of them, but there's a bunch out there. And I kind of pose it to the community to keep looking, find different ones that work, because that's how we discover new things and keep on growing. PostX, over to you, Aaron.
So we're going to talk about PostX now. We're not going to talk too much about your standard methods of PostX, but some alternate avenues that you may not have looked at before, or may not even be privy to. But with different types of cloud services coming online, that is a critical part of enumeration when you're doing these types of engagements. You may have landed on a user. Let's say you got compromised user's credentials that ends up not having any of your typical Active Directory access, but maybe he's an administrator in one of the cloud applications. So in this case, we're going to be talking about Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or Intune. It's an MDM cloud-based management service for basically managing enrolled devices in a corporate environment, and as well as a bring your own device network. So there's a few different things here. One thing is you see highlighted there, endpoint security. So what we're going to be talking about with endpoint security and scripts, essentially you can push with endpoint security, you can push policy changes, just like group policy objects you would do in that case. In this case, you can, let's say they're using Defender ATP or something of the like, you can actually disable that on whatever devices you have enrolled or you choose. This is all predicated on that user being an Intune administrator, which I've seen in the past. A lot of companies will set up a user, or they use an account and forget to disable that Intune administrator. It's not MFA enabled. It's sometimes a service account. So you're accessing this Intune publicly, not from within the internal network. and you have the kind of access that I'm about to talk about. So while I talk, you can just look at this right here. That scripts that I had just previously mentioned on the last slide, it's essentially PowerShell scripts that you can push to um, Azure Active Directory groups. So the only downfall of this is you actually have to manually go in and look at the groups to see which users and devices you'll actually be pushing to. This could be extremely important if you're doing this on a client engagement, because let's say you have a group that has a subset with a distro that is all users. If that all users groups has 35,000 devices, you will be pushing these PowerShell scripts to 35,000 devices. So it's really important that you pick small subsets of Azure AD groups. You look at the devices, maybe find ones that aren't compliant. With Intune, you can see which devices are currently compliant, or maybe you used endpoint security, you disabled any EDR on those devices before you push these PowerShell scripts. So if you don't delineate a user, it will run as system with administrator privileges. If you choose to run as the user that you're pushing to, it will run with whatever level privileges they have. And as you can see there, for shared devices, it will run for every new user that signs in. And these PowerShell scripts are pushed every time a device checks in. It's varying for some. It could be every 24 hours, every 12 hours. But essentially, that PowerShell script will run one time. You can see from a system administrator approach how this would be beneficial to pushing to hybrid join devices. But on the next slide, you'll see what you can use it for from a red team perspective. So it actually accepts any type of PowerShell script. So in this case, we just hosted a file on a S3 bucket. We delineated what our file would be called, used a basic web cradle to pull that file down and start that file from a specified folder. And below that screenshot you can see there will let you know whether or not that's succeeded. Some cases it may fail. In this case, I believe it was 40 plus devices out of 42 or 43 that successfully we were able to obtain a callback. So without generating any alerts, these do generate some artifacts that you could go and remove. But once this PowerShell script is completed, it actually removes whatever file is dropped on disk. But there are some artifacts left in the registry and logs that you can go in and remove. And on the next slide, you'll see, so basically that PowerShell script you just saw before was a file being downloaded remotely, placed in a folder on the device and executed, gaining administrative privileges on every system that call back. So you essentially just wait for that PowerShell script to execute, and you are then getting established C2 channels from various devices within a network. A lot of times, and in this case as well, it takes a little while for SOC personnel to catch up to what is going on, because they're just seeing these scripts being ran on various systems, users that have no interaction potentially with each other. So it can be a while before its IR is able to investigate this and run down what's actually going on. And with the buzzwords we like to hear nowadays, ransomware, I think you could probably see the potential of this in an environment to very quickly spread and compromise a lot of systems in a short amount of time.
So we kind of talked a lot about bring your own VM. So this is kind of where we wanted to kind of drill into this story. So, you've had entrenched like Aaron just described, but, what happens when you know that your PostX is going to get you burned? How do you still get, the goods? How do you still stay under the radar? And honestly, we swear by the bring your own VM type of focus. And honestly, what it is once you have your C2 channel, opening up a SOCKS proxy, you can do some amazing things with SOCKS, especially with the introduction of a virtualization environment, such as VMware or Fusion or whatever you want to use. But you can actually proxy the entire VM through the SOCKS and deliver it inside the network. Now, there are some caveats with regards to DNS and everything else, but that being one of the major cons doesn't outweigh all the goods you get. Because you're bringing your own machine inside the network, it adds a huge layer of anonymity. And because it's your own machine, there's no EDR, there's no security stack, there's no logging. This box is foreign to all those sensors, those devices. So you can, for lack of a better term, be invisible inside the environment. And once you're inside there, you can interact so long as you have the proper credentials and everything else, and you are taking the proper precautions, especially with DNS, writing maybe static routes, pulling out some enumeration. You can actually navigate and connect to resources inside the organization, and it will never know where the source is coming from because it doesn't know this device. So this is very effective, especially when you're trying to stay below, say, for instance, you're up against a very mature client, or a lot of products that you just can't. You just know from previous experience, or you just know that any type of PostX, whether it be like an execute assembly or even a beacon object file, they'll get you caught. This is really where proxying comes into play, because you don't even just need to bring in a VM, but you can also proxy, attack tools that are based in Linux through the environments, such as, Certify, any type of packet-based tools with high success, because they just don't know where the source is, because you're essentially using that system you've compromised as a pivot point in. And so in this case, we were able to establish a foothold and proxy, and just as a precaution, our own VM. Well, one of the goals was to get to sensitive client data. So we had managed to pull down and gain access to a lot of SQL service accounts and other accounts. So what we ended up doing is just installing MS SQL onto our VM, which was proxied in, and then connect to those actual SQL systems via our machine. Using their credentials, we were then granted access because we were inside the network, we had the valid credentials, we had the right client, everything else is taken care of. And so from that point, there was nothing logging. They had locked down those SQL boxes that only certain people could access them and everything else. But the service itself was open to anything else. And all we had to do was just position ourselves in the right place in the environment and have the right user's credentials. And all those security controls they put around their prized, their crown jewels were circumvented. And this is such an effective tactic, and it's so hard sometimes for an organization. The only way, and when people ask, how would you stop this? You really can't. But what you can do is fine tuning your egress controls. If you see an endpoint constantly sending traffic out frequently to the same destination, same domain, or that should be something that should trigger enough of an alert that you have then an analyst investigate. Honestly, because SOCKS requires almost near second interaction. There's no delay, not every 60 seconds. You wouldn't be able to do anything like proxying if there was such a big long delay, because then there'd be issues, connections would restart or terminate. So it's really important when you're looking for something like this, seeing those abnormal amount of traffic spikes. How do you do that? Baseline. It's the best way and simplest way. You have to baseline all your systems, servers and workstations. It's not easy, but it's highly effective. Another great example, especially from that VPN perspective, if you have the ability to kind of dump down, using any type of tooling, the environment, finding a system like a server that has, some kind of dev reason or some kind of like, not production-based service is very good. because they're often not really focused in on. I like to kind of say that like workstations are really hard to compromise because they're the front end users. The users are constantly using the internet and traffic's going through there. So they're a point of failure. So blue teamers and security defenders, they always focus on that front line, but not the servers that do, some stuff. Maybe they do like, once again, maybe SQL or some kind of automation in the background. Oftentimes we see them, they don't, especially dev or QA systems, they don't have the same scrutiny or security stack, to the point where we've seen it where there is no security stack at all on it, and it's simply just Defender. And once you have that, if you have the ability to RDP, typically you have some kind of elevated privileges on that box already, so you could probably turn off Defender. And now you have a server or a system in their environment that has no security product, probably nothing telemetry-wise being sent to the defensive team. And this is like your pivot point in. And you can kind of see in this example, the sheer amount you could do. So what we've done is, SMB pipe-based beacons through this one system. We were able to turn off the security stack on because it was not really focused in on. And you can kind of see the level of compromise we were able to do. And the problem here is that the only way that they could detect us is on these, different systems, but they still can figure out how or where we were going from, because that main system, there's no information being sent to them about. So it really makes it really hard if you're not tracking all your assets, and you're not monitoring them all, to be able to have this holistic view of your environment.
So again, going back to the cloud, so we know that a lot of good information can be stored in web browsers, not LSAS, since EDRs don't hook in to any of these cloud applications through web browsers. We can actually use tools such as Sharp Chrome to gain a treasure trove of either domain credentials, potentially any interesting websites that or applications such as SAP or Jira that a organization may use. And a lot of times those user connotations differentiate between from their actual AD username. So they might be like a numerical number or something that is unique that you may be able to gain access through. Obviously, you wouldn't want to run something like this on an actual system, but a lot of times we'll use our C2 channels to execute these types of tools in memory. Therefore, we're not generating any artifacts with binaries on disk, and we're able to extract any of that information that may be useful for us to further our attack.
So I know we hit you with a lot of information, but we want to just end off with one last thing before we kind of close down for the day. This is a big one that we kind of talk about a lot internally, is about off-the-shelf tooling. As I said, we're huge open source supporters of everyone's type of research and everything else like that. But when it comes down to actually deploying it, there are some kind of caveats we have to stop and think about. The more popular a tool is, or the more impactful it is, the more that there's going to be kind of scrutiny or research around it. And unfortunately, it's not always about focusing on the technique. A lot of times the detection is on something that they can quickly isolate. So whether that be a string or something along the lines, they can then target that, and that still works. Someone once said to me, it was an incident responder, that defenders don't really care how the alert was generated, so long as they got the alert and they need to respond to it. And that's unfortunately the problem as we are trying to, do these types of engagements for clients, is how do we make them better? How do we understand where the deficiencies are? If there's just a trigger on, say, a name or a string, how does, changing those strings, how does it then help them the next time when they're relying on these products? But the only way to really show that impact sometimes is what we call rolling our own tools. There are tons out there that do the same different thing. If something's super popular and you know it's effective, but you also know that it's going to get you caught a burn, look for something similar that does what you need, but is less popular or less known. So oftentimes there's not going to be that much scrutiny on that tool. In the case of domain reconnaissance, there's a popular tool, SharpRound. It's phenomenal. Everyone uses it. It's great. But because everyone uses it, it's the primary focus for detection. So much so you can actually see here from Windows Defender that they actually have a specific name for it. You can see it's called out as SharpRound. So we kind of use and deploy a different tool developed by myself called Vive. It pulls down the same Active Directory information, just in a different way. And it's highly effective. We've never been caught using it, but that's just a great example. It has nothing to do with one being better than the other. It just has to be done with one's more popular than the other. And that's honestly the unfortunate state here. So one of the things I always suggest to people is start developing your own tools, pull down the code, modify it, learn. This is the best way to kind of develop your skills. So as we kind of wind down, I know, it's near the end of the hour. We kind of just want to leave you with a few things. Aaron, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So getting the data. So like we said, information gathering is key. When we first started this, we want to make sure that a lot of the OSINT we done is complete and is done as passively as possible. I see a lot of times where there's really no need to ever be probing a company's perimeter infrastructure actively, when a lot of that can be either identified or validated through passive means. And then getting into validating that data, again, if you have a huge list of employee usernames, we demonstrated in this presentation that there are tools that you can use that will passively and non-attributably allow you to validate users before you actually begin, let's say, a password guessing campaign. Old or stale data, you don't want to waste your time with that. There may be a lot of subdomains or CNAMEs that are no longer active. So at that point, that may be the time where you do a quick probe through your build and burn infrastructure for common web ports, just to see what's actually live. And then we kind of talked about the cloud a little bit. It's another one of those buzzwords, and it is its integration into a lot of organizations is a lens I think that red teams have for a few years now been focusing on. But I feel that a company's layered security controls may not be covering that to the fullest extent that they can. And oftentimes there's loopholes that they might not know are benign to a system administrator, but could be catastrophic if used in the wrong hands.
Yes. And so last few takeaways we want to talk about here are command and control. This is always going to be part of your infrastructure. It's one of the key things for your success to be able to interact with systems and stuff. But as I mentioned before, it shouldn't be the first thing you pull the lever on. There are many different ways to be successful without sometimes even needing to use C2. We described VPNs, but there's other things. We've used in the past just straight up RDP if we've managed to get in. Using RDP to jump from one system to another is highly effective. And because it's native to the system, it's used quite a lot. It's hard to discern malicious versus normal use. And the simply reason why we kind of stress this is because while C2 is amazing, it's the primary focus of defenders to stop any type of egress in or out. And so where we kind of say is that because there's so much scrutiny, finding other ways to get to the same point is truly what you should focus in on. And if it's ultimately your only goal, make sure that you've taken the proper precautions, the layers, making sure you've tested it. It's so key these days to test it, not just against a Windows system, but against some kind of security stack. There's a lot of great products out there. I wouldn't recommend just uploading to something like VirusTool or those sites, but you can actually get small subscriptions. Even Microsoft has one of their E3 or lower ones that's very small that allows you access to Windows Defender for endpoint to test your implant, your loader, your attack on to see if there's anything you can improve before you get to the command and control section where it's transmitting data. taking that time and precaution is really effective and will make your attack much more successful. We talked a little bit about tokens. I just want to stress this. Tokens are magical. Azure, especially, it's been a huge key when companies have deployed things such as conditional access. It's also really powerful if you do get some kind of device token or something along the lines for gaining additional information or doing other types of attacks against the organization, especially since with the introduction of MFA and the standardization of it, tokens and session cookies are becoming way more prevalent and more powerful and should be your focus than traditional credentials. And lastly, I talked about it a few slides ago, tooling. Always look for stuff that goes under the radar or stuff. A lot of people out there, whenever there's something that's very popular, they'll make their own versions. They want to learn, they're great. Give them a shout out, test their stuff. It's how you contribute to the open source community. If you have big aspirations, start developing your own. I came from a background of nothing, never coded or doing anything. Start off with Python, moved into Go and other languages. Trust me, as you start going through this, you'll start to grow your skill set, and over time, you'll start developing your own stuff, and you'll soon be doing these talks yourself. Well, before we kind of wrap up with questions, I just want to say on behalf of Aaron and myself, thank you all for attending our talk today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out even afterwards. You can always reach me on Twitter, Tylus with 0. Aaron, do you want to give them a shout out to how they can reach out to you?
Yeah, sure. My keybase is Aaron_Martin.
Perfect. Once again, thank you for the time and have a great day, everyone.